December 29, 2006. The British Treasury transferred $83 million to the United States government. This was the final installment on a debt that began 61 years earlier, in 1946. 3 generations of British taxpayers had paid America for the privilege of surviving Hitler. But here's what they don't teach you in history class. That debt wasn't for winning the war. It was the price America charged Britain for the right to stay in the fight. And the interest payments were just the visible part of the extraction. Between 1940 and 1945, the United States executed the largest peaceful transfer of wealth in human history. Britain entered World War II as the world's largest creditor nation, controlling a quarter of the Earth's surface through the British Empire. Britain exited World War II bankrupt, stripped of its gold reserves, its overseas investments liquidated, its military bases leased for 99 years, and over $31 billion in debt to the United States. That's equivalent to over $400 billion in today's money. But the real cost was the empire itself. This wasn't charity between allies. This was the greatest asset-stripping operation ever conducted, disguised as aid, and it was executed with mathematical precision by the US Treasury, while Britain was fighting for survival against Nazi Germany. Before the war began in September 1939, Britain was the wealthiest nation on Earth. The British Empire controlled 35.5 million square kilometers, 24% of the world's land surface. British citizens owned $22 billion in overseas investments, the equivalent of $450 billion today. British companies owned railroads in Argentina, copper mines in Chile, rubber plantations in Malaya, and oil fields in Persia. The City of London was the financial centre of the world. The pound sterling was the global reserve currency. Britain held $6 billion in gold reserves, more than any nation except the United States. In just 7 months of war, all of that was gone. How? Because America demanded it. When war was declared in September 1939, the United States was officially neutral. Congress had passed the Neutrality Acts specifically to keep America out of European wars. But these acts contained a clause that would destroy Britain financially, cash and carry. The law stated that belligerent nations could buy American weapons and supplies, but they had to pay cash up front and transport the goods on their own ships. No loans, no credit, gold on the barrelhead before anything left the dock. Britain had no choice. The empire needed American steel, oil, aircraft, and weapons. The factories of Detroit and Pittsburgh were the only source, so Britain paid. In Operation Fish, launched in June 1940, Britain loaded its entire gold reserves onto battleships and ocean liners and shipped them across the U-boat-infested Atlantic to vaults in Canada and the United States. It was the largest movement of physical wealth in history. $7 billion in gold bars and securities. Britain's entire national treasure sent into exile to pay American bills. By November 1940, the gold was gone. But Britain was still ordering supplies, signing contracts for aircraft and tanks. The Treasury in London told the British Purchasing Commission in Washington there were no dollars left to pay. Britain was 7 months into a war that would last 6 years, and the money had already run out. On December 8, 1940, Winston Churchill wrote the most important letter of his political career. It was addressed to Franklin Roosevelt, and it began by describing Britain's strategic situation. German U-boats were sinking merchant ships in the Atlantic. The Luftwaffe was bombing British cities. The British Army needed equipment, ammunition, aircraft, tanks, everything. Then Churchill delivered the devastating admission. Britain was broke. Not struggling financially, not facing difficulties, completely and utterly bankrupt. The British Treasury could no longer pay cash for American supplies. This letter is taught in schools as a desperate plea between allies, the moment Churchill asked for help against Hitler. But read the letter carefully. Churchill wasn't asking for help. He was negotiating the terms of Britain's liquidation. The reality of Lend-Lease was negotiated behind closed doors between the US Treasury and desperate British officials. And the American leading those negotiations was Henry Morgenthau Jr., Treasury Secretary and Roosevelt's closest advisor. Morgenthau was not interested in garden hoses. He was interested in stripping Britain of every asset it possessed before providing $1 of aid. In December 1940, before Lend-Lease was even approved by Congress, Morgenthau demanded a complete audit of the British Empire. He wanted a list of every asset owned by the British government and every asset owned by private British citizens, anywhere in the world. Think about what this means. Britain was fighting for survival against Nazi Germany. London was being bombed nightly. And America's condition for aid was that Britain open its financial records to a foreign power and prove it was completely destitute. The British negotiators, led by Sir Frederick Phillips, were stunned. Phillips argued that Britain had already sold its gold. He explained that forcing the sale of long-term investments during a war would be a fire sale. Britain would get pennies on the dollar. He warned that stripping Britain of its overseas income would leave the country destitute after the war. Morgenthau was unmoved. His position was simple. If Britain still has assets in America, why should American taxpayers subsidize the war? Liquidate everything first, then we'll talk about aid. Congress was debating Lend-Lease through January and February 1941. Isolationist congressmen argued that Britain was secretly rich and was trying to trick America into paying its bills. Morgenthau needed proof that Britain was truly broke. He needed a sacrificial offering. He found it in American Viscose Corporation. American Viscose was the largest manufacturer of rayon and artificial silk in the United States. It was owned by Courtaulds, a British company. The corporation was worth over $120 million and generated $10 million annually in dividends that flowed back to London. Morgenthau told the British negotiators they had to sell it immediately and deposit the proceeds in the US Treasury to pay for existing weapons orders. The British resisted. Selling American Viscose during a war under duress would be financial suicide. But Morgenthau gave them an ultimatum. Sell American Viscose or Lend-Lease dies in Congress. On March 15, 1941, the British government seized American Viscose Corporation from its owners under emergency war powers. It was a compulsory purchase, no negotiation. The sale was handled by American investment bankers who knew Britain had to sell. They drove a merciless bargain. American Viscose sold for $54.4 million, half of its actual value. A consortium of 17 American investment banks, including Morgan Stanley, Goldman Sachs, and Lehman Brothers, handled the transaction and pocketed substantial fees. The British government paid Courtaulds in pounds in London, adding to Britain's internal debt. The dollars from the sale went straight to the US Treasury. This wasn't a transaction between allies. This was a foreclosure. America was liquidating British assets at fire sale prices, while Britain was fighting Hitler. But American Viscose was just the beginning. Morgenthau forced Britain to sell $650 million in US securities and stocks held by British citizens. British owned shares in American companies across every industry. Investment portfolios built over a century. By mid-1941, Britain had liquidated $1.1 billion in American investments, equivalent to $22 billion today. The US Treasury tracked every sale, verified the proceeds, and only after the liquidation was complete did Lend-Lease funds begin flowing. But the humiliation went beyond financial assets. In September 1940, before Lend-Lease was even proposed, Britain had negotiated the destroyers for bases deal. Britain desperately needed destroyers to fight German U-boats in the Atlantic. Roosevelt agreed to give Britain 50 old World War I destroyers sitting in mothballs. These were obsolete, rusting, barely seaworthy ships that the US Navy didn't want. In exchange, Britain gave the United States 99-year leases on military bases in Newfoundland, Bermuda, the Bahamas, Jamaica, St. Lucia, Trinidad, Antigua, and British Guiana. Think about this trade. Britain gave America strategic control over the entire Western Hemisphere, the Caribbean, and the North Atlantic for 99 years in exchange for 50 obsolete ships. These bases allowed the United States to project military power across the Atlantic. They became the foundation of American hemispheric dominance, and Britain gave them away for ships that barely functioned. It was the geopolitical equivalent of pawning the family estate for grocery money. The Lend-Lease Act passed Congress on March 11, 1941. It authorized $7 billion initially, eventually growing to $50 billion for all Allied nations. For Britain specifically, $31 billion in aid over 4 years. The propaganda called it the arsenal of democracy. Roosevelt said America would be the great supplier of weapons to defeat tyranny. And Lend-Lease did keep Britain in the war. Without American supplies, Britain would have been starved into submission. But Lend-Lease was not a gift. It was a lease. The name itself reveals the truth. Britain was leasing American equipment with the understanding there would be a reckoning. And buried in the Lend-Lease agreement was Article 7, a clause that would destroy the British Empire as an economic unit. Article 7 required that, in return for aid, Britain must agree to eliminate discriminatory treatment in international commerce after the war. That sounds benign. Free trade, open markets. But discriminatory treatment was code for imperial preference. Imperial preference was the economic wall that held the British Empire together. It was a system of tariffs where British goods were cheaper in empire markets than foreign goods. Canada, Australia, India, and South Africa all bought British products because British products had preferential rates. This system protected British industry from American competition. American cars were better. American machinery was more efficient. But in empire markets, British goods were cheaper because of tariffs. Article 7 required Britain to dismantle imperial preference after the war. Britain had to tear down its own economic walls and let American companies compete freely in empire markets. The British negotiators understood what this meant. It was the death warrant of the empire as an economic unit. But German bombers were overhead. The U-boats were in the Atlantic. Britain signed. As the war continued through 1942, 1943, and 1944, the wealth transfer accelerated. American industry boomed. US GDP grew 75% during the war years. American factories produced weapons for the war and consumer goods for global markets. Britain, meanwhile, converted every factory to war production. Britain stopped exporting. British companies abandoned markets in Latin America, Asia, and Africa. And who filled those markets? American companies. While British factories made Spitfires, American factories made Spitfires and refrigerators, radios, cars, and tractors for the entire world. The United States was fighting the war while simultaneously capturing Britain's commercial future. By 1944, the transfer was complete. Global gold reserves had moved from London to Fort Knox. The financial center of gravity had shifted permanently across the Atlantic. But Britain believed the sacrifice would be honored. British officials believed that because Britain had fought alone for 2 years, because Britain had bankrupted itself to defeat Hitler, America would be generous after the war. They believed wrong. On August 15, 1945, Japan surrendered. World War II was over. In London, crowds celebrated outside Buckingham Palace. The war was won. 7 days later, on August 21, 1945, President Harry Truman signed Executive Order 9620. Lend-Lease was terminated. Immediately. Completely. American supply ships in the middle of the Atlantic were ordered to turn around and sail back to the United States. No transition period, no grace period. The lifeline was cut. The British government was paralyzed with shock. They had assumed aid would continue during Reconstruction. The British economy had been distorted entirely for war production. Factories needed to be converted back to civilian production. That takes time. Britain was importing half its food and nearly all its raw materials, paid for with Lend-Lease dollars. Without those dollars, Britain faced starvation. In September 1945, a dying John Maynard Keynes traveled to Washington. He was 62 years old, suffering from heart disease that would kill him within months. He was going to America not as an intellectual, but as a supplicant. Keynes believed he had a moral case. Britain had fought alone for 2 years, while America stayed neutral. Britain had sacrificed its entire economy for Western civilization. Therefore, America should give Britain a grant, $6 billion, not a loan, a gift, retroactive payment for the sacrifice. Keynes called it justice. But when Keynes arrived in Washington, he discovered that justice was not a currency the Americans traded in. The American negotiators, led by Fred Vinson, were unmoved by Keynes's moral arguments. The war was over. The American public was tired of paying for Europe. The Americans offered a loan, not a grant. A loan of $3.75 billion at 2% interest. It was barely enough to survive, and it came with conditions designed to destroy what remained of British economic independence. The most devastating condition was sterling convertibility. The Americans demanded that within 1 year of receiving the loan, Britain must make the pound fully convertible. This meant anyone holding British pounds could walk into a bank and exchange them for US dollars. The Americans framed this as free trade, but it was a trap. During the war, Britain had forced its colonies to accept payments in pounds, but had forbidden them from converting pounds to dollars. This created a closed loop. Countries like India, Australia, and Egypt had pounds, but could only spend them on British goods. The system protected British industry, but the Americans wanted it destroyed. They knew that if the pound became convertible, everyone holding pounds would immediately sell them to buy dollars, because American goods were superior and everyone wanted American products. Keynes knew this condition would destroy Britain. He fought against it until his health collapsed. But the alternative was starvation. Britain had no choice. The Anglo-American loan agreement was signed in July 1946. Keynes died in April 1946, his heart giving out under the stress of trying to save his country from its closest ally. The winter of 1947 was the coldest in British history. Blizzards buried the country. Coal froze. Power stations shut down. People shivered in unheated homes. And in the middle of this frozen misery, the clock struck on the American condition. On July 15, 1947, Britain made the pound sterling convertible as required by the loan agreement. The result was a massacre. The moment the window opened, the world rushed to sell pounds. Countries holding sterling for years unloaded it for dollars. In 1 month, Britain lost hundreds of millions of dollars from the loan. The hemorrhage was so severe that after just 5 weeks, on August 20, 1947, Britain was forced to suspend convertibility. Britain had burned through a quarter of the loan in 5 weeks for nothing. The humiliation was total. This financial collapse had immediate geopolitical consequences. In February 1947, Britain sent a telegram to the US State Department. For a century, Britain had been the guardian of Greece and Turkey, keeping Soviet influence out of the Mediterranean. The telegram said, "We can no longer afford it. We are leaving. If you want to stop the communists, you have to do it." This triggered the Truman Doctrine. The United States stepped in to fill the vacuum. It was the formal acknowledgement that Britain was no longer a superpower. In 1949, with the economy still stagnant, Britain devalued the pound from $4.03 to $2.80. Overnight, the British people became 30% poorer relative to the rest of the world. But the final humiliation was the debt itself. The Anglo-American loan of 1946 was not forgiven. It was a commercial debt with 2% annual interest. Every year for 6 decades, the British Treasury wrote a check to the United States Treasury. Through the economic boom of the 1950s, the inflation of the 1970s, the Thatcher privatizations, the Blair years, the payments continued. Britain deferred payments 6 times. In 1956, 1957, 1964, 1965, 1968, and 1976, when exchange rates made payment impractical. But the debt remained. The final payment was made on December 29, 2006, 61 years after victory. The total amount repaid, including interest, was $7.5 billion to the United States and $2 billion to Canada. So who benefited from this extraction? Henry Morgenthau Jr., who orchestrated the liquidation, remained wealthy and influential after the war. He never faced consequences for stripping an ally during its darkest hour. The American banks that handled the forced sale of British assets, J.P. Morgan, Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley, made millions in fees. They facilitated the liquidation and profited from the desperation. American corporations that bought British assets at fire sale prices made fortunes. American Viscose, bought for $54 million, was worth over $120 million. The buyers more than doubled their money instantly. The military-industrial complex that supplied Lend-Lease equipment, Boeing, Lockheed, Ford, General Motors, were all paid by the US government, which billed Britain. These companies made billions from the war, while Britain went bankrupt buying their products, and the United States government itself. By 1945, the United States held 2/3 of the world's gold reserves. The dollar replaced the pound as the global reserve currency. American military bases circled the globe. The US had achieved global dominance not through conquest, but through debt. The British Empire wasn't conquered. It was bought. The United States acquired the assets, the bases, the markets, and the geopolitical influence in a distressed asset sale managed by the US Treasury. And this wasn't unique to Britain. The same playbook has been used on every American ally since 1945. Germany was rebuilt through the Marshall Plan, but Marshall Plan aid came with conditions. Germany had to open its markets to American goods, host American military bases, and align its foreign policy with Washington. Japan, after 1945, was occupied and restructured. The Japanese economy was rebuilt with American aid, but Japan became a protectorate. US military bases in Japan remain today. Japan holds over $1 trillion in US Treasury bonds and cannot pursue independent foreign policy without American approval. South Korea after the Korean War, US military presence, US economic influence. South Korea is wealthy but strategically dependent on American protection. The pattern repeats. Crisis creates dependency. Dependency requires concessions. Concessions transfer wealth and sovereignty to the United States. Understanding this isn't about hating America or revising history. It's about seeing how power actually works. Empires aren't built through obvious conquest anymore. They're built through finance, debt, and crisis management. When your ally is desperate, when the bombs are falling, when starvation is imminent, that's when you extract concessions. That's when you force the liquidation. That's when you rewrite the terms. The special relationship between the US and UK is celebrated as an alliance of equals. But read the documents. Look at the numbers. Britain gave everything. America took everything. In December 1940, Churchill wrote to Roosevelt begging for aid. In doing so, he signed the deed of sale. He traded the empire for survival. It was a deal that had to be made. There was no choice. But the cost was the future. Britain defeated Hitler but lost the empire. Britain won the war but was bankrupted by its ally. And 3 generations of British taxpayers paid America for the privilege of surviving. The Lend-Lease agreement wasn't the arsenal of democracy. It was the greatest asset-stripping operation in history, executed with legal precision while Britain was fighting for its life. The same playbook used on Britain in 1941 is being used right now. The dollar as reserve currency. The debt trap of US Treasury bonds. The military bases that ensure dependency. It's all the same mechanism, because that's how empires are really built.